last section, we talk about two kinds of receptors, baroreceptors and chemoreceptors that do reflexes. And these are all in your notes, so this is the same information. Baroreceptors are stress receptors that monitor changes in pressure inside internal cavities. They usually are inside like the walls of blood vessels or inside the walls of, say, your digestive system. And feeding nerve endings are in the walls of blood vessels. They monitor blood pressure and flow, or they're inside tubes of respiratory, digestive, and urinary tracts that monitor volume changes. So this is, when I pass my, I'm going to tell you a joke which you may not find funny, but I find hilarious. When I passed my dissertation exam for the PhD, we were having a little celebration. So my professor, he told me this little joke that this other physiology professor told him. And he said, "All life's greatest pleasures involve the emptying and filling of tubes." Well, just think about it. Respiratory, digestive, urinary. So that was my one lesson from physiology I remember from grad school. A couple of you like it. Anyway, so we have in our digestive tract, the colon, the lungs, the carotid sinus and the aortic sinus. So for blood pressure, rhythm of breathing, digestion. And so when you fill up, they change the signals they're sending to let you know that the organ is full of whatever it is. You know, the pressure is too high, it's full of food, things like that. The second ones are chemoreceptors, which are specialized neurons that detect small changes in the concentration of specific chemicals in the blood or other body fluids. And if they change too high or too low, and they go out of brains, then it'll immediately stimulate the brain stem to initiate corrective function. It's all part of homeostasis. They're found in the medulla and other brain areas. They're also found in the carotid bodies, which are the internal carotid arteries of the neck, and also the aortic bodies where it comes out of the heart. And the main three things they monitor are all listed here. They monitor blood pH. Remember talking about how pH is important in the body in chapter 2 or 3? Remember we talked about that? You're going to get that again in AP2, but as we talked about before, your body is very dependent on keeping the proper pH. And if it gets out of whack anywhere in the cerebral spinal fluid, the blood, interstitial fluids, in the cells, your body's going to try to correct it, because your body doesn't work properly if the pH is off too far. And so we have receptors scattered throughout the body to make sure the pH is always right. And so if it changes, then we can do something about it. The other big thing that it monitors, and this is in both the medulla and the blood vessels, is the amount of CO2 in the blood, which we call partial pressure, which we'll learn about in AP2. So the amount of CO2 also is very important. If CO2 is too high, it's bad for us. We want to keep it at a certain level. That's why we breathe out CO2 when we breathe. It also checks the level of, monitors the level of oxygen in the blood. If it's too low or high, we initiate corrective actions. Probably the two most important that we worry about, and the two most chemicals that we worry about the most in the blood are pH and CO2. Did I give you that equation about, did I tell you the thing about the main buffer of the blood? Did we have that in the earlier section? Anybody remember the name of that?
Main buffer.
No idea.
I know you probably remember it being asked in an earlier test. What's the main buffer of the blood? I told you it was carbonic acid bicarbonate. Anybody remember that? I'm going to write an equation, which you don't have to know it for this test because I won't ask it, but I guarantee you if you're in my class, you'll see it again, and well, Dr. McConnell too, you'll see it in AP2. And this is the equation. Again, it's not on the test on Thursday, so don't worry about it. I'm paying planting the seeds for the future. And this will go to,
Yeah. Yeah, just text me. I was reading this morning. I forgot.
and if you notice, so if you have more CO2 in the blood, you make more carbonic acid. If you make more carbonic acid, you make more acid. So oftentimes, these two are very linked. More CO2 means more acid. Again, you do not have to know this for this exam. I will not ask it, but you will get this in AP2 with whoever you have. So this is why it's so important. This is why CO2 and pH are so important, because the amount you have in your blood from breathing, if it's too high, your blood gets acidic.
Then you die.
And then you can have comas and die. And so you immediately try to change your respiration and do other things to get it back in balance. So this is extremely important for homeostasis. You got to keep these two, all three, but especially pH and CO2 in a constant level. Because if they get too high or too low, it spells trouble for the body. And you'll learn all about why that is in AP2. But you're getting introduced to the concept here. This is where they are in the respiratory centers of the medulla, chemoreceptors of the carotid bodies, and the aortic body. Of course, you get to learn all the blood vessels too in AP2 as well. So again, if it changes here, if it changes in the respiratory center, you change how you breathe to fix it. If it changes in your blood vessels, you adjust the respiratory or cardiovascular activity to get it back. Again, I'm not going to ask you how you respond. The main thing I want you to know is what is a chemoreceptor and what are the three main things it detects. pH, oxygen, and CO2 in either the cerebral spinal fluid or the blood, mainly. Two main places. Okay. Now the last section is on sort of the overall how it is controlled. And so as it says in this picture, the body's chemoreceptors which play important roles in reflexive control of respiration and cardiovascular function. So again, if it gets out of whack, you change your breathing or your cardiovascular function to fix it. And as I said, you'll learn why in AP2. So the last section is on the control. The autonomic nervous system has multiple levels of motor control. So I'm going to go back to the notes for this. So all this that I said is all in here and in your type notes. So in section 9, the levels of activity in the sympathetic and parasympathetic are controlled by centers in the brainstem that regulate specific functions. Simple reflexes are based in the autonomic ganglia and spinal cord, and they provide rapid automatic responses. If it's more complex, it's usually coordinated by centers in the medulla, which are regulated by the hypothalamus. So if I ask you on a test, who's the top of the hierarchy of the ANS, your answer is hypothalamus. And he mediates his effects through the medulla. The medulla they both have centers for regulating this, but the hypothalamus is the main control center. And these centers are in turn regulated by the hypothalamus, and you have all these centers in the medulla. Cardiovascular, respiratory, you have to know all these. Salivation, swallowing, digestive secretions, urinary function. So all of those are centers in the hypothalamus and the medulla that regulate a lot of your autonomic reflexes. However, higher brain can influence these. So the limbic system, thalamus, and cerebral cortex all can influence the autonomic system through the hypothalamus. And you've all had experience of this, like when you become angry or sad. Let's say angry, your heart rate and blood pressure go up, and then you tell your kids, you're making my blood pressure go up because you're mad at your kids because they do something bad. I don't know, all the parents can relate to that. Or sad, you know, your boyfriend left you or whatever.
Or Dr. Hawker gives you a bad grade.
Dr. Hawker gives a bad grade, which
You
really rephrase it as you earned a bad
I
grade.
I knew that was coming.
And so, what I just told you right here, I want to underline this. Hypothalamus is the central processing center or headquarters for the ANS. And so, but it can be influenced by the higher brain. So I want to show you this picture from the book before we go on, if I can find it.
490.
So, as it says here, autonomic ganglia, simple reflexes, medulla more complex, like the ones we just listed in the notes, and they can be regulated by all these higher centers, limbic, thalamus, cerebral cortex. Hypothalamus is the top. And of course they don't show this, but I like this picture in your book, so I'm going to put it up. So you might want to star this picture because it kind of is a good summary of what's in your notes. And I'm surprised they didn't put it because I really like this picture. I'm just having trouble with it. So notice, headquarters, the hypothalamus, sympathetic and parasympathetic headquarters. They can relay a signal either through its control through the pons for breathing or medulla for all these other things that we just went over. Cardiac, vasomotor, swallowing, coughing, respiratory, and then they send signals down to either the sacral for parasympathetic, that's blue, and sympathetic through the spinal cord, pink. It's color coordinated. However, as you can see in the upper part of the figure, you can have control. You can have regulation at higher levels. You can relay the sensory information to the thalamus, you relays it to the cortex, through the limbic system. It can be affected by emotions, memory, behavior, like you smell. I said this story before, you smell a perfume or a cologne, reminds you of your first love of your life, and then you start getting blissful and sad and
Or angry.
more angry, yeah, and then your heart rate goes up because of it. So now you're linking memory and emotion with your autonomic control. And you get angry. And then you may be passed to this conscious, subconscious level. So, and then they can influence hypothalamus and pons as well. You might start breathing faster and all this.
So that's the subconscious level when you go above that, so when your blood pressure goes up and stuff like that because you're upset?
Yeah, because you get upset, your blood pressure rises, so then you can feel it, so you become aware of it. And you can feel the redness in your face increasing, the blood flow increasing. People, they're often when they get mad, their faces get real red, right? I think sometimes people do. Their faces get very red when they get angry.
That's when I run the other way.
You guys work in retail, you know what I'm talking about. When customers get mad for whatever reason, I have. And sometimes people just get totally illogical, mad about the stupidest things, right? If you work in retail, you know what I mean. And they yell at you for no reason, at least that's logical.
Pick your battles.
But you guys say, yes, ma'am, whatever you say, ma'am, or sir.
Oh, I know.
Anyway.
Fuck that.
Anyway, so they can all influence it. So the last figure shows how things are all related. And I'll get to that in a second. We go back to the notes. And so the SNS and the ANS are organized in parallel and are integrated at the level of the brainstem. Integrated means they receive and process information. So they can influence each other and they go sensory pathways carry info to both the somatic and autonomic systems that may trigger integrated and compatible reflexes. High levels of integration involve the brainstem and hypothalamus. And motor outputs from the somatic motor system go through lower motor neurons, the skeletal muscle, and they're parallel to the motor output of the autonomic system through preganglionic and ganglionic neurons to effectors, which are cardiac, smooth muscle glands, adipose. You've heard that 100,000 times by now. And they can be integrated at many levels: brainstem, hypothalamus, limbic, and cortex. So this is all summarized in this figure on page 491, which I want to show you. See, I like these summary figures because it helps you understand it. So you get here's your relay centers in the brain. You may send out a somatic reflex, the skeletal muscle. Here's sensory pathways coming in. You start here, they come in. The relay in the brainstem. They may go up to the hypothalamus, visceral sensory, or somatic sensory to the thalamus and cortex for awareness. It can be modified by the limbic, emotions, memory, etc. And then it may come back through the hypothalamus and brainstem as a autonomic response. If it's in the central nervous system, it's a long reflex. If it's just inside the peripheral nerves, it's a short reflex. You affect visceral effectors. Or if it's mediated through the somatic, it'll just go directly to the skeletal muscle. So they're kind of in parallel. So this picture summarizes what's in the last part of your notes in a diagram form, if that's easier for you to, whatever is easiest for you to absorb. Okay. So if you look at page 492, I would recommend just to help you learn this, number 2, and also, even though I probably won't ask a lot of number 2, but it helps you get straight. Some of them definitely. The number 2 I would do, and also number 1 to help you understand how things are related. So 1 and 2 are good study questions on page 492. And last but not least, we have a few medical terms that might show up. Autonomic nerve neuropathy, which is defined on page 454. If a neuropathy affects one or more autonomic nerves, you may have multiple effects on the ANS that interfere with reflexes, which could be fainting, low blood pressure when standing, constipation, urinary incontinence, and impotency, often due to diabetes. This, I can't say that, but an inherited disorder in which the ANS functions abnormally, resulting in reduced tears, poor vasomotor control, motor incoordination, skin blotching, abnormal pain sensations, heart difficulty swallowing, vomiting, and emotional instability. Hyperhidrosis, excessive or profuse sweating due to intense stimulation of sweat glands. Found normally in only 4% of the population. You can also see it in certain diseases like thyroid or pituitary gland diseases, diabetes, menopause, certain drugs, or mercury poisoning. Reflex sympathetic dystrophy is a syndrome that includes spontaneous pain, painful hypersensitivity to stimuli, such as light touch, and excessive coldness and sweating in the involved body parts. Usually involves hands or feet. Can result from trauma or surgery that appears to activate sympathetic nervous system. Okay, that is the end of that. So now we're done with our notes. So the next thing I want to do is the sample test questions.
Extra pen.
Posted. Hopefully you've seen it.
Is this same as our stuff?
Okay. So here's some kind of questions you might see on the exam.
It was dropped.
So, number 1, accurate information about the position of the body in space is called proprioception. True or false?
True.
True, very good. Number 2, this is the stuff I was telling you you needed to know. That's the type of nervous system type in A with its type of neural pathway in B. Somatic would be
How? Oh, wait,
B.
better start off.
B, you said B. Very good, Sam, it is B, correct. Sympathetic is which one?